So we are live, Dr. Lynn. So I think we have to wait a couple minutes, just our viewers can join us.
Okay.
Wait. How are you doing, Dr. Lynn?
Pardon me?
How are you doing?
It's good. It's good. We're figuring out how to telework where I live. How about you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Dr. Lynn. So everything is online in our
Yes.
case. Yes. So yes, our viewers joined us. So good evening, dear friends, Bishkek American Center online visitors. We are going to start our webinar, and please welcome our special guest today, Dr. Lynn Bufka. So she's Senior Director of Practice Research and Policy at the American Psychological Association. So, practice research and policy department focuses on on the development and implementation of programs and policies related to expanding opportunities for professional psychology. So, Dr. Bafka is an advocate for science to support practice and practice-based evidence to inform research and policy. So, additionally, Dr. Lin received her PhD in psychology from Boston University, and moreover, she is the fellow of APA's Division 12. So, and today, Dr. Lin will be talking about how to stay healthy and manage mental health during pandemic. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Lin, for accepting the invitation and for your time. I think we can start, and I will give the turn to you.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you this evening. It's the morning for me, so if I mess up the time, please forgive me. I have not used this platform before, so I'm going to start sharing my screen and hopefully everything will go smoothly.
We can see your presentation, Dr. Lin.
Excellent. So, as you've been told, we're going to talk about how to manage anxiety and take care of ourselves during this time of this global pandemic. For many of us around the world, we have various degrees of being told to stay at home, to practice physical distancing, to reduce the spread of the virus. And we know that frontline workers and individuals who must go out to the workforce are really at much greater risk for COVID-19 and experiencing some increased distress. But for all of us, there's no clear end to this pandemic. There's tremendous uncertainty about what's likely to happen. And certainly in the United States, we have inconsistent messaging from our leaders about what to expect. All of us are seeing a tremendous number in the US, loss of life, grieving for things that we aren't able to engage in right now. We don't have our usual rituals to support grief when we lose a loved one. Many things have changed about our life. So it's a very unusual time, and it's raised a lot of stress for many individuals to work in adapting to this. But there are things that we can do to support our overall mental well-being at this time as well, and that's important to remember. So what's the foundation of keeping ourselves mentally healthy? There's really four things that we're going to emphasize, but that's the foundation for our physical and mental well-being. But then there are many things that we can do beyond that as well. Hopefully, everyone is sleeping well. It's important to have consistent sleep habits. If you want to keep your bedroom, the place where you sleep, as relaxing as possible, and to use it only for sleep and only for intimacy. Particularly your bed. If you spend a lot of time in your bed doing other things, you start to associate your bed with things other than sleep. And then at night, when you want to sleep, it can be harder to fall asleep because you don't have that association of the bed is always used for sleep. So if it's possible, keep your bed to a sleep room and use it only for that. Also, we want to be really careful about our use of electronics. Certainly in the United States, people pick up their smartphones, they look at it right away. They're on their smartphones until they go to bed. And there's a lot of data that tells us this does not help with our sleep. So if we can set some boundaries around our use of electronics before bed and when we first wake in the morning, and we also at this time, because the news can be so incredibly stressful, to put some limits around when we pay attention to the news as well. So allow yourself adequate time before you're planning to sleep to wind down to go to sleep. That's one of the critical things to do to protect your overall health and well-being.
Dr. Lynn,
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I don't see the changing of the slides.
Oh.
Yes, sorry for that.
Are you seeing, so you don't see a slide that says physical activity now?
I can see only the main slide. And
Oh, very strange. Well, I see that here. Okay.
if I share my screen,
Sure.
okay, I will do it. So you can stop sharing your screen and I will do it.
Okay.
Okay. So
So I have gone to slide 4.
okay, do you see the presentation?
I do see that.
So I can move the slide.
Okay, so I'm at slide 4 now.
Okay.
So we talked about sleep, and now we'll talk about physical activity. So another thing that's really a foundation to our overall well-being is physical activity. In the US, we recommend that people get at least 60 minutes a day of physical activity. It doesn't have to be all at once, but it's beneficial for us both physically, which we know, but it's also really good for us psychologically. There are so many positive benefits to being active. It helps us to release energy. It helps us to have some time to focus and to think about other kinds of things and to move our bodies in ways that our bodies are intended to be moved. So really encourage regular physical activity as well. If possible, going outside to be active is really good, whether you can do nature walks, things like that, because we know that nature has a lot of benefits for us as well. And where you can in the US, and I don't know how prevalent it is where you are, we have opportunities to exercise with online classes as well. So we have to be creative, but we can do things to stay physically active. We also want to think about our nutrition. So the next slide, please. And we know that it's important to have a good plant-based diet, lots of fruits and vegetables, less processed food. That's a real issue in the US. Our diets have a lot of processed foods from stores as opposed to home-cooked meals. So the more that we can have plant-based prepared foods at home as opposed to buying ready-made foods, it's going to be more helpful for us. We also want to be really careful to be mindful of what we eat. At this time, many people do what we call stress eating. So might be eating things that are less healthy, consuming too many sugary foods, not eating enough of foods that keep us healthy. Some people are overusing substances, alcohol, and other drugs. So we really want to focus on good nutrition because that's good for our mental health too. Next slide. And then the fourth area of our foundation is really being socially connected. And for many people, this is a challenge right now because we are supposed to stay physically distanced. So how do we stay socially connected? Using technology is a great way to do that. You can make game nights over technology. People have book clubs. When you are connecting with others, we really encourage discussion of topics other than COVID-19. The coronavirus is consuming a lot of our lives, but there are other things that interest us too. And having the connection around the things that we share in common and that we value with the people we love is really helpful. So encourage people to talk about things other than the illness. And if you need to, schedule weekly check-ins or daily check-ins with the people that you care about the most. Because if you're not going to see them personally in the flesh, seeing them virtually can be really helpful when you can. But we can also connect with people in other ways, via telephone or snail mail or email, anything that gets us with people that we care about and we're able to share our thoughts and feelings or just laugh and have fun with. We need to have that in our lives as well. That helps us to stay more balanced and healthy in our lives. But broader than that, we want to think about our overall well-being. I talked about the foundation that we have, and you'll see in this circle that there's both physical, emotional, but we also want to think about our intellectual well-being, our social well-being, our occupational well-being, our spiritual well-being. We know people do well if they have a sense of purpose. So no matter what's happening in the world right now, are there things that give you meaning and give you some purpose in what you're doing? Are there ways to engage your brain? Do puzzles, read interesting books, learn something new if you can. Those are ways to keep your overall well-being and your intellectual well-being. Some people are developing a new interest. Other people are super busy and don't have the time to do those things, and that's okay too. But if you can, sort of use this as a checklist of, am I paying attention to all these aspects of myself? Am I paying attention to being creative, my spiritual side? Am I expressing gratitude? These things all help with our overall well-being. And these are areas to pay attention to no matter what's going on in the world. And the more that we have good habits in these domains, the more we're going to be in a better place to face whatever comes. But now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the kinds of things that we might want to address now. So the next slide, please. So when we think about news and social media, this has been a real challenge for many people right now. You get online, you see all kinds of distressing news, and you feel compelled to look at it and to see what's happening. But we actually need to control that. We need to control how much we're paying attention to the news. We know that too much news increases people's stress. People who, when we survey people, we ask them how distressed they are. Those who are spending lots of time online, reading all kinds of information about the news, report feeling more stressed. The reality is, for most of us, there is not going to be news that this moment is going to change what we're going to do immediately. So we probably can get a reasonable understanding of what's happening in the world in a certain amount of time. And we have to decide for ourselves what that amount of time might be, but set some limits. Decide how much you need to know, what you need to know, and when you need to know it. I've done various things to think about when I access the news. I'm much more likely to do it in the morning for a little bit to see what sort of changed, what I need to know about for the day. And then in the evening, but definitely not right before I'm going to sleep, because I want to understand what the overall picture is that's happening in my world, but also need to be able to focus on the things that are happening in my house and in my community. We also want to think about our use of social media. Social media can be great, but it can also stress us out because we can feel like there's a lack of control over social media too. We really encourage you, if you're finding yourself being very reactionary, very emotional in response to what you're seeing, and perhaps posting things in return that aren't in keeping with how you would normally talk to people, that's a good time to walk away from social media. Try to develop good habits with social media. I personally have set a timer on my smartphone that tells me when I've spent an hour on Twitter and Facebook. And once that happens for the day, it shuts them off. I can override it. I can still access those if I want to, but it's a good reminder for me to turn my attention elsewhere. We also can try to not be consumed with social media first thing in the morning or right before sleep. Have routines in the morning that help you orient to the world in a positive way. And similarly, as I talked about with sleep, have routines at night that help you settle down for sleep. But social media can be really good, and we really encourage people to use it in beneficial ways. So if you're engaged with Facebook, if you're engaged with Twitter, whatever you're paying attention to, make sure the sources you're following are reliable, that you're trustworthy sources. And if you're going to be posting content, think about the content you're posting. If you've got valuable information that's reasonable to share, go ahead and share that and let people understand it. Set it up with hashtags so people can find it. Answer questions if people have questions about what you're saying. But be aware of how you present. Your content will always be discoverable, no matter what you do. If you delete it, there are people who know how to track things down once it's out there and online. So be aware of how you're presenting and how the world's going to see you. You want to reflect your own values and your ethics, but you want to be respectful of others and differences too. I personally like to use social media for fun too, to find humor, to help me find the good in others, and I use it to follow some of my own personal interests. In a time when much of the world is feeling very distressed, I see the use of social media as a way to sort of be an ambassador of kindness and connection with others. When we think about physical distancing, which we really need to do to slow the spread of the virus, we don't want to be isolated. So we talked about some of those socially connected ways to stay together. I know families are doing game nights with video conferencing. There are individuals who are doing book clubs online. There are so many museums that are opening virtual tours, and it's possible to do a virtual tour while you're connected to somebody via Zoom or otherwise, where you can share the experience with a friend as if you're going to a museum, even if you're not together at the museum. We want to try to be as open in our communication with others, especially children. So if there's children around you who might be asking questions, think about what's their understanding of what's happening and answer in a way that's reasonable. Support children, let them understand that you're concerned, but also, don't tell them more than they can actually understand when we're talking about little children. But I think another place for us to pay attention to is our neighbors and friends and family members who are at greater risk for being isolated. If we're able to reach out to those folks, let's do it. Let's make those connections. Send a card or a letter to somebody you care about. Call your next door neighbor. Drop off groceries if you can for those who need it, because there are some people who are really at risk for isolation. But the thing is, when we do those nice things for others, we get a benefit as well, and it helps our overall well-being. It helps us feel like we're doing something positive in a time of crisis and challenge. Many of us are teleworking right now, and for those of us who are fortunate to be able to do that, it also means that the boundaries between our home and our work can be very blurred. We are living and working in the same space all the time. So it becomes really important to set some, if we can't set physical boundaries around it, set some time boundaries or other kinds of routines. So I don't get online for work until about 8:15 or 8:30 in my morning. I try to end my workday around 6:30 p.m., although I'm not always successful with that, because work is always there. I could always check email and do other kinds of activities, but I have to set a routine that allows me time to do things that are fun and that are engaging and that I enjoy. As I said, try to avoid working on your bed as well, because you don't want to associate work in bed. You want to associate sleep in bed. When possible, take mini breaks between tasks. Get up and leave your workspace, walk around the kitchen, step outside if you can, go on a patio or a balcony, get a little fresh air. Anything you can do to break things up. At a minimum, try to look away from your screen on a regular basis, because that will reduce the eye strain. And anything we can do that supports our physical well-being, that connects to our mental well-being too. You want to have as much flexibility as you can with telework, because it's changing. We don't know where things are going to go. So think about it as flexibly as you can. Also, we know we're seeing this a lot in the United States. We use Zoom primarily for our video conferencing with others, but just being on video conferencing all day long, whether it's Zoom or whether it's another platform, Skype, or using whatever platforms are popular where you are, that's exhausting. And we know that it is. It requires actually different cognitive mental effort to do video conferencing all the time, because you can see lots of people on the screen, you're trying to focus on them. It's a very different experience than being in person, and it really is more challenging in some ways than an in-person meeting. So understand that and take breaks from it. When possible, try not to schedule multiple video conferencing meetings in a row to reduce some of that fatigue. Also, don't expect that you're going to be perfect during this time or that you're going to be incredibly productive. That may vary. You are, at the same time you're teleworking, you're coping with the significant changes in how we are living in our day-to-day lives. And that requires effort and energy. Whenever we're dealing with uncertainty, that takes a lot of mental energy. And that then makes it harder to do our work. So think about what's realistic, what's expectations are manageable, and talk with supervisors about that. Try to manage that in a way that's appropriate. Certainly, if you're in school right now, you've got to meet the demands of the educational system, but don't expect that you're going to be also on the side learning all sorts of new other things, because you're dealing with a lot of change, which is taking energy and effort. So figure out what your priorities are, focus your work efforts towards that, and try not to set up unrealistic expectations for doing many other things during a time when you're adjusting to a different way of functioning. So there's 5 in-the-moment strategies that we can talk about right now that, if you're feeling really distressed and overwhelmed, can really help you. And they're the 5 areas here, and we'll talk about each one. But before I get there, what I'd like to say is it's important to practice these even before you feel stressed and overwhelmed. Because when you feel stressed and overwhelmed, it's really hard to do a new behavior or to try anything different. So try some of these things when you're feeling okay and see what happens. And if it's something that you think might work for you, do it a few times, so that when you are feeling particularly distressed and overwhelmed, you can say, oh, I tried that way of calming myself down. Let me do it now and see if that makes a difference. So first, we're going to talk about how to calm yourself. So the next slide. So when you calm yourself, what we want to do is try to slowly breathe in for a count of 4, then hold your breath for 4, and then breathe out for 6. And if you're able to do that several times in a row, you'll find that your overall rate of breathing slows down. When we get really distressed and anxious, our system, our body tends to react. We tend to overbreathe. We tend to breathe harder, but we don't necessarily breathe any deeper. Our heart might start racing. We have various what we call physiological impacts of when we feel really stressed and anxious. If we can slow down the breathing by slowly breathing in for 4, holding it for 4, and then breathing out for 6, that has a very powerful effect on slowing down what your body feels like. And that then makes it easier to pay attention to the things that are demanding our time and energy, as opposed to feeling just very agitated and anxious. This is a very powerful tool, and I use it regularly when I need to feel a little calmer and more focused. Next, please. Sometimes our brains are racing all over the place, and we're thinking about all the things we need to do, or all the possibilities of things that could go wrong, or what we're distressed about, whether it's thinking about the current pandemic or other kinds of things that might be happening. So sometimes it's helpful to try to just focus our thinking, and we can do that by picking a category like animals or food, and we can try to name something that fits in that category with every letter of the alphabet. So if you're thinking about animals, you might think about an anteater, and then a baboon, and then a cat, and then a dog, and then an elephant, and kind of work your way all through the alphabet. I've often done this for those of you who speak multiple languages. When I was learning a language, I would often use conjugation of verbs as a way to sort of distract my thinking from whatever I was worried about, but then to sort of focus on something different. And when you're able to do that, when you return to the task at hand, you may not find your brain streaming through all those other additional thoughts. So it's really an effort to try to slow down rapid, fast-paced thinking. If the thinking doesn't work as well for you, you can also try to visualize things. Some of us really benefit from visual kinds of efforts. So perhaps you pick a room in your house, or you pick a favorite place that you like to visit. I like to go to a particular beach, and I like to go to a particular field near my grandparents' farm. So I can visualize that and start naming things, trying to identify the trees that are there, the grasses that are growing. And that can also help to focus us mentally in a new way. We also want to relax. I love this picture. This frog looks very relaxed. When we want to try to relax physically, we want to tense each muscle group in our body for 10 seconds, and then release. And release for more than 10 seconds. So you might just grip your hand really tight and then let it go. And you want to do that throughout your body. I usually start either at the head and work my way to the feet, or work my way down from the feet and up. So you might do legs, arms, trunk of the body, head and face. And you want to focus on what it feels like when that muscle tension leaves your body. Just like when we feel stressed and anxious, our breathing and our heart rate can get very active, our muscles can get very tense as well. And that can interfere with our ability to just move comfortably in the world, to respond. And that can interfere then with our ability to address the task at hand. So feeling physically relaxed is very helpful as well. We also find it helpful sometimes to just ground ourselves. Sometimes we get so overwhelmed with everything that's going on. The grounding yourself really is like this picture looks. You're just going to try to focus on what are your feet touching? What's your body feeling? What's the air like? What surfaces can you feel? If you can, close your eyes and think about, what do the texture of my jeans feel like against my legs? What does the ring on my finger feel like? What can I smell? What sounds do I hear around me? Can I detect a slight breeze, or what's the temperature? Anything like that can sort of pull us out of our anxious rumination, our worked up feelings, and can sort of refocus us so that we can then focus on and deal with whatever we want to deal with in our life. And lastly, it's really important when we're feeling distressed and overwhelmed to also remember that things do go well, that there is likely something about the day that you can celebrate, some positive thing. If it involves somebody else, tell them, recognize them, because they might be struggling too. And it means the world to have somebody tell us, wow, you did a great job with that presentation. Or I was really happy when you brought in donuts for us to share. Or thank you so much for texting me this morning and asking how my parents are doing after whatever experience that just happened, right? That we're concerned about their health. Thank people for what they've done. When we celebrate the good and share gratitude, there is a pronounced positive effect on our mental well-being too. So we help others and we help ourselves. We know that being in quarantine, being in physically distanced, sheltering in place, this is hard. Reminding ourselves that we're all making sacrifices for the larger good really, really helps. Some people find it very depressing and draining, and others have just felt like they've had enough with this. But you really want to think about, what's my perspective here? While I'm trying to quarantine, while I'm trying to abide by expectations to physically distance, the reason for this is to slow the spread of a virus that is fatal for some individuals and for which we do not have adequate treatments yet. So what I'm doing is trying to sacrifice a little bit of what I want in order to help everyone get what they want, which is really good health for all of us and the ability to live our lives as we'd like to. We have to work on finding perspective. We also have to accept that our life has changed and it is going to be different. It may not be like this forever, but we don't know when it's going to end. Trying to rail against it and saying, I hate this, I don't want this, all that does is increase our negative experience of it. If we can accept that this is how it is, that frees up our energy to focus on what is it that we do have some control over, what challenges can we meet. This isn't a threat to overcome, but these are challenges we can meet. So everything we can do to sort of shift to how do we cope and how do I address the problems that I can address are really important. So when you're thinking about feeling distressed and overwhelmed, whether it's for yourself or others, our feelings are real. Validate the feelings. It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. Comfort people who are feeling distressed. And if you need some comfort, seek that out. Find somebody who can listen to you and hear what you have to say. You want to make sure the basic needs are met, but you also want to make sure that you're thinking about your emotional needs. We want to work hard to manage our reactions and emotions. We don't want to deny them. We don't want to try to squash them all away, but we do want to be sure that our life in the world is not being driven by our emotional responses, but it might be being informed by our emotional responses. So that's what we mean by managing reactions and emotions. We also try really hard to develop helpful thinking and positive attitudes. So by helpful thinking, I mean things like thinking about whatever is happening right now in a way that's fairly realistic without making it into a catastrophe. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. I never know how I'm going to overcome this. When we talk about our experiences in that way, it makes us feel more negative and distressed, and it makes it harder to find solutions. So we can look at things and say, yeah, this is pretty challenging, but I think I can handle this. We are far more resilient than we often give ourselves credit for. And we want to give ourselves as much capacity to be flexible and resilient right now so that we can work through and live our lives as completely as we can. I guess that's the words I'm looking for. So think about how to prioritize the activities that you have and focus on problem solving the things that you can work on. Those are some basic psychological skills and strategies that we're all trying to develop. And that as we develop them, they'll help us now and they will help us down the road. So APA, the American Psychological Association, has a lot of resources online. It's almost overwhelming. So you all have these links and we can try to share them with you so you can get them if you need them. But there's some good information out there about how to be resilient right now, how to handle physical distancing, the benefits of nature, work and telework. And we've got some additional resources on other slides. So you can show those, but I think we can open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lynn. I think I can return to. So, I'm here. So, thank you very much. It was really a useful and insightful presentation. So I think it's time to turn to Q&A session. And the first question is, Dr. Lynn, what is the long-term effect of too much information?
So really, it's going to be how do we manage too much information? For some individuals, information becomes overwhelming and it can interfere with our capacity to make decisions, to decide what are the important problems that we have to address, and to then come up with solutions to that. We often feel very overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there. I read a really interesting data point and I can't find a source for it, but the amount of information in one Sunday New York Times, which is the biggest, most popular, widely read newspaper in this country, apparently is equivalent to the amount of information most people consumed across their lives in the 1700s. So when you think about how much information is out there, our brains aren't built to handle all of it. So we have to figure out what do we need for our current life and what's going to help us determine how to proceed. And once we've obtained that, we don't need to get more unless information is changing. So reading 5 different stories about the same question does not help us make decisions in a new way. So we need to think about that when we're consuming information, because long term, it really, at a minimum, is going to use up valuable mental resources. And at the worst, it can really overwhelm us and lead to more stress.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sue. So the next question is, if you don't read the newspaper or social media in general, you are uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you are misinformed. What should we do?
It's really hard, right, to find good information and to know what's accurate. So I think one of the challenges is to develop a somewhat critical mind about what we read. Does this fit with other information that we have? Can I trust this source? Do I want to believe it just because I've read it? Or do I think it needs a little more verification? So it's not that we want to avoid information altogether, but we do want to develop a little more critical sense of reading it. And it's not something that we're all good at all the time. I would like to believe every story that tells me that chocolate is good for me, because I really like to eat chocolate, but I have to be critical about that. And that's a very light example. We also need to be really careful about what our leaders are telling us sometimes, because sometimes they just don't have the information, and sometimes we can be misinformed by others. So trying to have different sources of information and see if they are consistent or if they're leading us in different directions tells us we may need to be more critical about the news that we're hearing. So we have to try to strike a balance between being informed, but trying to find good sources of that information.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lynn. So the next question is, what would you recommend for the families that have issues during this lockdown? Spouses, parents, and kids.
Yeah, I feel very sympathetic for families, particularly with families with younger children at home. But anytime we've got multiple generations under the same roof, there could be, and we're all feeling somewhat distressed and overwhelmed. So there's several things we can try to do, depending on the age of the children. Trying to find time for each person in the house to have some alone time, some uninterrupted time, whether that's 10 minutes or 15 minutes a day, but just some time when that person can be by themselves. And it may mean that they have to lock themselves in the bathroom because there might not be anywhere else to go, depending on the size of the house and how many people are in it. But having a little bit of alone time is really helpful for individuals. We also have to recognize that other people are feeling distressed and overwhelmed, and don't take their responses completely personally. They may be responding because they're feeling anxious, and it might not have anything to do with you. That's hard to do, particularly when it's people we live with and people we care about, because we hope that they're thinking of us with their best interests. But to the extent that we can try not to really react negatively to other people in our house, that helps too. If there's a couple of adults in the house to work with the children, that helps, because you can share that responsibility and you can say, okay, it's your turn now, I get a break. So that anytime that the adults can sort of help one another and support one another becomes really critical right now. With children, we have to think about how old they are, what they know, what they can understand, and what their needs are. Young children, all children want to feel loved and understood by their parents. That's probably the most important gift that parents can give their kids. And it's really hard right now. We can't expect our kids to have the same understanding about the world that we do as adults. So it really is important for parents to try to understand that. Children, as they get older, become teenagers and young adults. It's important to try to understand the parent's perspective if you can. It's not always easy, but it's important to do that, because they may be feeling really overwhelmed about, how can I work and take care of my family? Will I be able to pay the bills? Do I have everything we need? And so recognize that they are particularly stressed too. Younger children aren't very good about doing that because they're very much paying attention to themselves. They don't understand the world otherwise. And we also need to help ensure that younger children understand that if mom and dad are stressed out, it's not necessarily because of the children. Younger children tend to think that when mom and dad are mad or stressed or unhappy, that they're the cause. And right now, that may not be the case at all. So making sure your children understand that is really helpful too.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. So the next question is, do you have increase in the service of psychologists during the current situation in the United States?
Do we have an increase in psychological services? Is that? Yeah.
Yes.
So it's interesting. We see a lot of people reaching out to crisis text lines and hotlines on their phone and calling up in distress. We don't see people as many a high incident of people reaching out for sort of traditional mental health services. We expect that they will be in the future, but we see a lot of people using text hotlines, trying to find online platforms for help and services right now. People are feeling distressed and overwhelmed, but haven't quite figured out what is going to be the best thing to meet their needs. But we anticipate that there's going to be a long-term, significant psychological need in the country. Not only because of the level of distress and anxiety that the population as a whole is experiencing, but also because of the adverse outcomes of having had COVID, family members who've lost somebody, the healthcare workers on the front lines. Those are all going to be groups that have particular needs post-pandemic as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. So the next question to you. What are warning signs and risk factors that people may be experience emotional stress?
Yeah, there's a lot of warning signs, but sometimes we're not always very good about picking up on them. I think it's always good with somebody you care about, somebody you know, to just ask, how are you doing? And if you're not sure, if you don't really believe the answer of I'm fine, you could say, really? Are you sure you're fine? Because I know I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed. So if you can have the conversation, that's great. But things that are really concerning that we want to watch out for, well, when people get more irritable, I wouldn't say that's really concerning, but that's certainly a sign that people are feeling more distressed and overwhelmed. Irritability, quick to react. Other things that are a sign that things are really changing are when people start behaving in ways that they haven't before, that are unusual for them, or when people have a hard time doing whatever is their role, whether they're having a hard time being a parent, having a hard time being a student, having a hard time working. Those are signs that perhaps the emotional and psychological distress are getting to be overwhelming. Those are all important things to look for. Changes in behavior, changes in how a person is able to function in their day-to-day life, marked changes in mood. Irritability is a big sign right now. Excessive irritability and often an inability to feel like the person can control how they're feeling emotionally. So perhaps crying at times that don't seem to warrant crying, or not feeling that they can adjust and move out of feeling really sad. And the most that we can do when we're doing okay, reaching out and asking somebody those questions and sharing our observations, saying, you don't quite seem like yourself these days. Is there anything you want to talk about? And if they really are having a hard time, you don't have to have the answers, but you can say to somebody, this sounds really hard. Can I help you find somebody who can help you more than I can? And that's a way to get started.
Thank you very much, Dr. for that. So the next question is, does online therapy really work?
Does online therapy?
Yes.
Yes. So the data is really clear that therapy via video conferencing, like you and me looking at each other, or even over the phone, the data is very clear that can be quite effective. So, and as effective as in person. We have less science behind whether or not communicating with a mental health professional via texting alone We don't know if that can be as helpful. We just don't know. We believe that people can feel supported in that way, and that it can help people get connected to more intensive intervention, but we just don't know enough about texting. But for video conferencing and phone therapy, absolutely, it can be as effective as in person. And we hope that there's going to be a lot more studies of that, because we've got this great, as a scientist, we've got a great experiment going on right now. And it would be really great to see, who does it really benefit? And are there particular conditions or situations we need to be sure to have in-person therapy for? As somebody gets more distressed and overwhelmed, we want to be able to connect them to more intensive care. So that's important too.
Thank you very much. So the next question is, what are some of the things you can't control, for example?
Right. Well, I don't know about you, but I know I cannot control other people's behavior. So I can control my own behavior. I can control my own reactions. I can control how I think about events. And I can have some control then over what might happen based on the choices I make. But I'm not going to be able to just tell somebody else how to behave. I'm not going to be able to control what they do. So trying to change somebody else is not necessarily going to work. I can encourage them. I could let them know I'd like something to happen, but I have to accept that that's not something I have necessarily direct control over. I do not have control over how long this virus is going to be circulating in my part of the world. But I do have control over my behavior, and whether I'm wearing a mask if I'm interacting with people, whether I'm maintaining physical distance, whether I'm reducing the number of times that I'm interacting with others. I have control over those things. I don't have control over whether or not somebody else does those things, but I can try to manage my reaction if I'm upset or angry that someone's not doing those things. I can decide if it's appropriate for me to say something to someone. And it's probably appropriate for me to say something to my husband or my son or my friend if I think they aren't behaving safely, but I probably can't have any control over a stranger. So me saying something to a stranger about whether or not they're wearing a mask is unlikely to change the situation and may cause me to get even more worked up and anxious and angry. So I have to think about that. What are the things that I can do something about? I can also think about my thinking, and sometimes we like to think that we can control everything, or that we have a lot of ability to impact things. And the way we think about those future events often can influence us. So we probably want to be thinking about things like the coronavirus is something that is spreading widely. I do not have the ability to stop that. But it also doesn't help me to be thinking about it as, oh my goodness, we're all going to get this and we're all going to die. That doesn't help me either. I can control my thinking about it's an unknown. I don't know how likely it is. My risk based on my assessment of the situation is fairly low. So I'm going to make these kinds of decisions about how I'm going to continue to keep my risk low and keep my community safe. Those are ways that we try to shift our thinking to things that we do have some capacity to do something about.
Thank you very much. So the next question is, how to deal with the negative people and people who exaggerate?
How to deal with negative people and people who exaggerate. It depends. Sometimes we can not have those people in our lives, or we can limit our interactions with them. Depends on the nature of our relationship with those people. So if people we are particularly close to tend to be very negative, we can try to redirect them. We can say things like, wow, that sounds like a really negative way of thinking about this. Have you ever thought of X? And give a different way of thinking about it that may not be as negative. So we can try to do that. It doesn't always work with everybody, and it depends on the nature of our relationship. We can also decide how much do we want to spend time with those individuals, and we can let them know, you're very negative about this topic, and I don't want to talk about it with you. And if you're going to continue talking about it, I'm going to leave, or I'm going to hang up the phone, or I'm going to end the conversation. we can do that to some extent as well. We also want to try to remember that because someone else is negative doesn't mean it's about us. We don't have to take on the negative feeling that they have. That is theirs. And we can try to help them change that and perhaps give them another perspective, but we don't have to share it. We don't have to own it ourselves. And that can be helpful too. I know it's really hard to try to distance ourselves from others and to set those kinds of boundaries. And I have had many times when I've thought of great things 30 minutes after I ended a conversation. But if we know that we have people that we have particular patterns with that are really hard, sometimes we can think about a way we might want to handle it in advance. And then if that moment happens, we're able to use that strategy and say, you know, Dad, whenever you talk about this, you get really upset, and then I get upset. I would rather we talk about something else. And you just have to repeat that. And if they can't handle the redirection, you can say what's truthful. If it's truthful, you can say, I love you, Dad, but I can't have this conversation right now. Goodbye. Whatever you need to do. But you have to also think about what's important for you in order to maintain a healthy way of looking at the world.
Thank you very much, Pauline. It was the last question. But also we received a couple of comments. So a very useful presentation. Thank you. Especially agree with that we need to try to become the ambassadors of kindness and social justice. And the next comment, I also really like this and the presentation in general and think that this is what many of us need now. So thank you very much, dear friends. So first of all, it's huge thanks to you, Dr. Lynn. It was a really wonderful and useful, informative session, and so many useful strategies and tactics we learned today to manage anxiety and mental health. So during this pandemic situation, and on behalf of our viewers, I also want to say thank you. And also thank you very much, dear friends, for your comments and for your questions. So I think it's time to finish our session. And see you tomorrow, dear friends, at 11 o'clock at English Language Teachers Corner session. So stay healthy and have a great evening. And for those who watch us in the United States, so have a great day. So thank you very much, Dr. Lynn.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking with everyone. Bye.
Bye.